The situation in Afghanistan has gone from bad to worse, as most people predicted, and within a matter of days the Taliban have taken complete control over Afghanistan. The internationally recognised legitimate president has fled the country and is in exile. The vice president is in exile, and Maulawi Hibatullah Akhundzada is the now sort of de facto leader of the country. This is not just a really sad day for democracy and freedoms and human rights, but an enormous indictment of Western interventionism. So how did all this start? How did we get where we are? And what can the UK do about it? Because of course I'm British, most of the viewers are British. You know, you guys saw, what can we do? So, many years ago, in the 1980s, right up until about 1992, Afghanistan was a far less politically unstable country. Now, it had its problems, and there was an insurgent Islamic extremist group called the Mujahideen, and the legitimate government was one that was socialist, at least in name, and it was supported by the Soviet Union, so you can make of that what you will. But essentially this government was socialist and became more democratic as time went on, to the point where it was a fully democratic socialist administration by the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. So you might be thinking, well, that sounds good, what happened? Well, there was a lot of internal conflict, and of course, even though there were now multi-party elections, the Mujahideen still didn't want to join. Now, their leader was a man named Osama bin Laden, who you might have heard of. And the US backed the Mujahideen as a way of essentially uprooting the support and the power bases of this democratic socialist government, because it was seen as an enemy, it was seen as a threat. And of course the foreign policy of Ronald Reagan was significantly more hawkish than his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, and he wanted to really, send the Russians a message. So when the Russians then sent troops in, the Soviet troops arrived to invade Afghanistan and support the government, it was on, basically. The US wanted to prove their dominance and the USSR wanted to prove theirs, and ultimately it was the US who was successful. Afghanistan's legitimate democracy, which had some pretty strong secular elements as well, it just collapsed in 1992. So after that, the country was primarily governed and controlled by the Taliban, even though the Northern Alliance, that was Western backed, weren't, they were seen as the more legitimate of the two forces in the country. But there was a huge sort of power vacuum, and it was filled by various forces. And of course, then in 2001, there was the September 11th terrorist attacks on American soil, and the World Trade Center. And 9/11 was a huge tipping point in this, and George W. Bush wanted to go and send troops into Afghanistan, invade the country, destroy the Taliban's presence there, and basically annihilate Al-Qaeda. And the remaining forces of Al-Qaeda would then flee to other countries where they'd be able to get, caught while they were on the run, kind of thing. Because of course Al-Qaeda were the ones responsible for 9/11, and bin Laden was the mastermind behind that. So the Mujahideen turned into Al-Qaeda. It's an important thing to remember. So the Mujahideen were being armed and funded by the United States government. Then they evolved into Al-Qaeda and committed the worst terrorist attack ever on American soil. So it's kind of just unfathomable. It's really hard to get your head around, but the US armed people who later then committed atrocities against them. But the US does this a lot. They arm these very vicious far-right or extremist or, very kind of pro-authoritarian and horrible, groups. They've done that many times in South America, they've done it in Africa, they've done it in the Middle East, they've done it just about everywhere, because they see it as a lesser of two evils when they're fighting against a left-wing movement or a socialist movement or a Marxist movement, whatever it is. So, the US did that. Then 9/11 happened. George W. Bush wanted to do that. So they had the invasion of Afghanistan. He lobbied for a lot of international support. Tony Blair said, we stand shoulder to shoulder with you. The UK and US forces moved into Afghanistan. And after a few months, it seemed like the invasion had been relatively successful. George W. Bush was saying, mission accomplished and stuff. And the hope was, now that the Taliban had their power base significantly reduced and the amount of territory they controlled had been significantly reduced, that now would begin the process of nation building. Now would begin the process of investing in infrastructure, in industry, creating a proper, transparent, free and fair electoral system, a proper democratic political system, a fair and equitable economy, and investing in public services like healthcare, education, trying to instill democratic values into people, trying to make the country a much freer, more democratic place, and certainly a much more prosperous place. Those were the hopes of a lot of people, right? But unfortunately, as time went on, it became more and more clear that really wasn't going to happen. And Afghanistan's very, very weak and already quite corrupted democracy that was instilled, that was implemented by the Americans, withered away very quickly, to the point where the president who's just fled was not elected by the people, really. It was a sham democracy, and it's recognised on the World Democracy Index as authoritarian. So it's not as if we're going from a liberal democracy or anything like that to an authoritarian state. It was already authoritarian, but this is going to get a lot worse under the Taliban. So, of course, US troops stayed there this whole time, and it is the longest war the US has ever been involved in, 20 years, from 2001 to 2021. Joe Biden said he was going to take the troops out. They did. They've gone, for the most part, the military presence in Afghanistan. And the Taliban have swept the country in an incredibly short period of time. I mean, most people thought they'd retake Afghanistan, but predictions were, anywhere from 90 days to a whole year. And it's taken them an absolutely minute fraction of that time. It's taken them literally just a little over a week. So it's an incredibly devastating situation, particularly for the rights of women and girls. Women's rights under the Taliban are going to be basically nothing. There's plenty of evidence that both the people the US had funded and armed and the Taliban have committed acts of systematic rape and sexual exploitation and things like that, torture. But things are going to get a heck of a lot worse under the Taliban. We've seen horrendous scenes from Afghanistan, people fleeing in any way they possibly can. There's been aircraft taking off that have had civilians clinging to the sides of them. It's been reported that several Afghani civilians have died because they've fallen from planes that they were clinging onto for dear life as those planes had taken off. And it's an incredibly disheartening situation. It's hard to watch the footage that's coming out of there. So what on earth can the UK government do? Well, the Foreign Secretary went on holiday when he was advised not to because of the situation in Afghanistan, and he's only just come back and said a few weasel words. So Dominic Raab has really let us down there. But this government has been very poor on foreign policy since the very beginning, especially since 2016 after the Brexit vote. It seems like our whole all our priorities to do with foreign policy have become very strange and skewed. But even before then, they were terrible, as evidenced by the fact that we participated in this invasion without a clear plan of how we were going to improve the country and how we were going to stabilise the country. And in my opinion, we probably shouldn't have even went in Afghanistan in the first place, but at least go in with an actual plan of how to nation build. And this wasn't nation building, this was colonising, let's be clear. If you go into a country with a huge military force and then you stay there for 20 years and then as soon as you leave, that country, that regime collapses within like a week. You haven't been building an independent country, you've just had a colony. The UK ambassador to Afghanistan has actually been staying there and helping people flee. So his name is Sir Laurie Bristow, and he's held out at the embassy to get his people out first, and now he's at the Kabul airport getting Afghan interpreters out one by one. Because of course there is no government way of doing that now, because there is no legitimate Afghan government. So extraordinary courage from the UK ambassador, and something to be deeply proud of, Sir Laurie Bristow there. But the US ambassador's gone, and it's clear there are going to be a huge number of refugees, an enormous number. And the UK government has said it will not accept the refugees because that might encourage others to come. So we went into Afghanistan, we waged war there, we destroyed towns and villages, we destroyed people's lives, we sent our troops there to die for essentially no reason, and now that this mess is coming back to bite us on the arse, we can't even be bothered to accept refugees. It's absolutely disgraceful. So that's the first thing the UK government should be doing, offering a legal and safe path for refugees to come to the country. This is our mess. We have to take responsibility. The US has to take responsibility as well. I certainly hope they will, but I highly doubt that. The UK isn't taking any, because this government does not care about human rights. And it's like Tony Benn said, be careful of how a government treats refugees and asylum seekers, because it's how they would treat you if they could get away with it. And another immediate priority has to be getting British citizens out, if they're still there. Any British nationals need to be saved from those conditions and from the danger in Afghanistan. But this is one of those times where we have to reflect on the actions of our own countries here in the West, because we like to think we're so much more civilized. We like to think that we are so much more advanced and democratic and decent than a lot of other countries in the world, but it's often a total lie. A total lie. Our foreign policy is not built on saving people. It's built on exploiting people and funneling more and more profit to the military-industrial complex. It's about time that we see that, and I just pray for Afghanistan and the people there. It's an incredibly frustrating and upsetting situation, because there are no good options now. All we can do is accept refugees, which we're not going to do, and try and help get British nationals out, which I hope we do. But sending in as much foreign aid as we can, but at the end of the day, if the Taliban controls the territory, they may stop that. They may not want that. So yeah, these are very dark times. Thank you all for watching, and I hope this video has encouraged you all to think more about foreign policy issues as well as domestic policy in the UK and the US, and I'll see you all in the next one.